Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very last class of the Scotch Whisky Diploma as part of round two. Just a little reminder that there is another round coming up. If you have not yet applied, you have just a couple more days to do that. You can do that over at pdxcw.com/scotch. You're going to want to get that in sooner rather than later because this program is absolutely amazing. And we have the two gentlemen right above me to thank for this program and the amazing bottle of whiskey right behind me, Ardbeg, to thank for all of this amazing work. Speaking of the two very handsome gentlemen on screen with me, I'd like to introduce Cameron George, the U.S. National Ardbeg Ambassador, and one of my oldest friends, David Blackmore, and not in his age, but we've known each other for almost 20 years.
I'll take it the right way.
David Blackmore, the global ambassador for Ardbeg and Glenmorangie. I had to double check that title because it was extra fancy, David. Today, we are not just talking about our senses and how they work with Scotch, but we're also going on an in-depth exploration of Ardbeg 10, Ardbeg Wee Beastie, and Ardbeg on OS. So make sure you've got those questions ready to go. We have the two leading experts in the world right here to answer all of those questions. But before we get into anything today, I want to remind all of you, if you like this kind of content, please like us on Facebook, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, follow us on Instagram at PDXCW, and always please comment and ask questions. We love to see the comments. We'll be pulling them up on screen as we go along. And again, if you want to apply for the very next round of Scotch Whisky certification with EWA and Ardbeg, you can sign up at pdxcw.com/scotch. All right, got that out. All right, you only have a week. You have 1 week left, so get those applications in there now. All right, guys, I'm going to kick it over to you, Cam. I know you are the brainchild behind this beautiful presentation.
I love it. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you as well there, Lindsay. I had such a great time at camp over the last week as well. Touched my absolute heart and soul to see so many amazing young new squirrels be welcome into the community. So if any of y'all are watching, hello, cheers, slanjava, and I hope that your travel all went really, really well and you returned home incredibly safely as well and that you enjoyed yourselves at Camp Runamuck. David, where in the world are you this week? It seems like you are always on another adventure whenever we get to cross paths.
Yeah, New York City today. New York City. Actually, doing a little Ardbeg launch this evening over our friends, the Brandy Library, for the 4th batch of the Ardbeg 19 Trevan. So I'm excited. Excited for that. And Cam, I want to ask you. You know, you've just come back from camp. Where's the traditional black eye? What's happened? Come on.
I escaped camp unscathed this time. You know, for anybody who has not attended camp, please make sure that you apply for 2023 because it is an experience of a lifetime, but more importantly, the community that surrounds it is actually the real highlight and the nugget there as well. That's the takeaway. And I will always encourage people to keep their elevations very low at camp, but keep your expectations incredibly high with that, as well as anytime you dive into a glass of Ardbeg. So, David, I don't know about you, but I have a little bit of Ardbeg 10-year-old in my glass currently. So that's generally where I like to start off whenever I'm going to be having multiple Ardbegs in a day, because first and foremost, I think that whiskey is the thumbprint of the distillery and the distillery's kind of DNA. More so than talking about the actual whiskey itself right now, I think we should actually get into the science of understanding how the human body perceives how it is equipped with multiple different apparati and weapons and tools, if you will, to perceive or analyze a whiskey. So let's go ahead and pull up our presentation, which was named by the one and only Michael Moberly. When it hits your lips, how to taste whiskey. So
as opposed to when it hits your eye.
Exactly. Right. So let's go ahead and move into the very first slide here. I'm of the belief that the act of drinking whiskey is quite subjective. The act of analyzing whiskey is quite subjective. I've said it 1,000 times over that I can't drink whiskey with your face. I wouldn't want to because I'm obviously the handsome of the two of us here. But I believe that you can't drink whiskey with somebody else's face, or also the implied learnings from that person's upbringing, and also the flavors and aromatic profiles that may be most relevant to them as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's no question in my mind that the biggest inconsistency in the whole dynamic of tasting whiskey is the person who's tasting it, both from person to person, like you said, but don't forget that you yourself are completely inconsistent. I am too. That your experience of the exact same whiskey from the same bottle even can be completely different depending on where you are, your mood, how tired you are, your surroundings. And as you said here, the sounds that surround you as well are incredibly can sometimes completely affect your experience of the whiskey. All of these other things can affect the experience of the whiskey, because when you taste a whiskey, it's more than just tasting. All of your senses are involved. So yeah, absolutely. That's what's fun about it for me, is that complete random kind of inconsistency. Every time's a new experience.
Absolutely, I definitely agree. Right. So, in the effect that I am not John Travolta and that this is not the movie Face Off, I can only drink whiskey with my face. But I think that we can have an applied scientific approach to the analysis, or the approach of analyzing a set of whiskeys. So today we're going to walk through 3 theoretical different whiskeys, but we're going to keep one consistent approach. And I'm of the belief that first and foremost, before anything else, human beings are visual eaters and drinkers, right? But if there is one sense that I would say that does come before that in the actual act of drinking whiskey, I'd actually say it's the auditory experience, right? The sound opening up a cork, and we can actually talk about that a little bit. David, how does opening a glass of whiskey or opening a bottle of whiskey make you feel?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably the main reason why so many brands can persist with cork, because as much as a screw cap or whatever may be greener and more efficient, there's nothing satisfying to opening a screw cap, really. So that when you pull that cork, whether it be a whiskey cork or a wine cork, that sound, that pop, is such a kind of, it's like opening a gift on Christmas Day. There's such sort of anticipation to it. So, and almost immediately with Ardbeg, you pull the cork and there's an instant smell of Ardbeg that permeates the whole room. So yeah, it's definitely that kind of anticipation moment.
Absolutely. And I one of the things I found doing a little bit of research for this segment as well, and just in general, talking about the sound of whiskey, is that, and not only limited to just the act of drinking whiskey, but sounds in general, they produce feelings that essentially are quite contagious, that uplift us from our day-to-day stress and make us think of happy/carefree times. I can think of no greater like happiness or carefree element than imbibing on a glass of Ardbeg for me personally.
Yeah, the other observation I'd make, you're absolutely right there, is that you can be in our jobs, in our world, we can be in a scenario where we need to maybe command a room to do a tasting, and there's a lot of people having fun and enjoying themselves and talking, and if you get that cork popped properly, the sound of that cork popping will bring everybody to attention. Everybody will focus on you. So it's definitely an important thing. I would add that when we're talking about the different senses here, I think it's fair to say that our sense of sight, our vision, is bombarded massively from the moment we wake up every day to the moment we go to bed. Adverts, everything else. Our sense of sound as well is bombarded with things. You can't turn that off. It's always there. And the one that is least used, I suspect, is the sense of smell and taste. It's there in the background all the time, but you don't really often consciously think about it. So that's another reason why it's that the whole thing is so exciting to me, is that you get to use a kind of underutilized sense whilst bringing in all the others as well.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And you made a really interesting point about the effect in a very crowded and quite boisterous room of opening up a bottle and hearing that light kind of pop. I actually think a couple of our sister brands on the champagne side actually embody this really, really well. Think about being out at a very crowded restaurant or even a bar or nightclub quite late at night. It's been some years for a couple of us as well, but the sound of opening a bottle of champagne, it immediately kind of snaps us out of whatever we were enthralled in and immediately immerses us back into an incredibly carefree and quite happy environment.
You often get a sort of cheers from corners of the restaurant or bar when you hear a bottle of champagne popping, don't you? So yeah, absolutely.
Yep, exactly. Right. So after you've now opened that bottle, the next act is to pour some of that whiskey into a glass. I've got my glass here. Quite a large glass today for me. Not generally one that I would actually be tasting out of. Usually I like to stem towards the Glencairn glass. David, how do you I know you have a lot of opinions on how a glass or the vehicle for your whiskey can drive your experience in completely different directions.
Yeah, as I tend to agree with you, for tasting and nosing whiskey in its purest form, I would tend to go down the kind of Glencairn route or the whiskey Copita nosing glass, tulip glass, something like that. But if you don't have that at hand for whatever reason, there's the usual options. Well, there's a few of them, of course, aren't there? And the one that people might reach for most regularly would be something like this. Now, be careful here. It's not wrong, but we just have to think about it a bit. If you're going to drink your whiskey on a big ice cube, which is perfectly acceptable, absolutely fine. Changes your whiskey, but it's a lovely way of drinking it. This is great. This is great if you're doing that. However, if you're looking to really nose a whiskey and get into it, get into the depths of how it works and explore the aromas and flavors, there ain't many glasses that are designed worse than this, I would say. This is not great. I mean, don't get me wrong. If it's all you've got, it'll do. But, it's not great. And likewise, one step worse if you're nosing just a neat whiskey. Now you've really extended the distance from your nose of the whiskey itself. So these aren't great either. But again, brilliant if you're going to drink a whiskey and soda. Fantastic. Lots of highballs, brilliant drinks. But for the purposes of what we're talking about here, nosing and tasting neat or with a dash of water, we're not really helping ourselves there. But fear not. I think, Cam, it's what you have as well. I'm in my hotel in New York. End of the day, there is nothing terribly wrong with using a wine glass. They are designed to slightly concentrate the aromas of a wine, and they'll do the same for your whiskey. So I would reach it. You may get some funny looks drinking whiskey out of a wine glass, but that's what I would tend to reach for if I had the choice. Out of those three, for sure.
I definitely agree that the tapered element and the tapered kind of opening of the wine glass, as well as the Glencairn and the tulip, it definitely slows the rate of diffusion of a lot of the I would call them even like lighter compounds and congeners, right? Some whiskey is quite literally a solution in the way that there are high and low volatility elements. Some of those things, especially when you start to swirl them, will evacuate a solution quite easily. So a tapered kind of mouth or lip of the glass will help slow the rate of diffusion just a little bit, and it'll give your olfactory system, which we'll cover in a little bit here, an opportunity to perceive as many of those different congeners in the whiskey before they evacuate it.
Absolutely. And the other thing, is that I'm in a fairly aggressively air-conditioned hotel room, and this glass I pick up is actually really cold, as is this. This one is going to be difficult to warm your whiskey to. And by warm, I don't mean like, all that nonsense from back in the 80s where people were warming their brandy over a candle and all that nonsense. I'm just saying getting your whiskey up to a temperature where you're absolutely right. Some of those volatile components can actually evacuate the glass and reach your nasal passage. If your whiskey is too cool and your glass is too cool, you can't do that. Luckily, the wine glass specifically designed to be able to have your hand help just gently warm the glass and the whiskey. So another good reason to be using this if you don't have a specifically designed whiskey glass, of which there are many great designs out there. So, these days, for most bars that are serious about their brown spirits, even their agave spirits, will have a Glencairn or something similar. And just make sure that you're asking for it. They should provide it, really.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think I've always kind of made this this Venn diagram, if you will, a theoretical kind of Venn diagram of spirits like tequila, spirits like mezcal, as well as some like high ester rums, like with high ester rum counts, and then also things like single malt Scotch whiskey. Even though historically they come from very different regions, I think there's an overlapping of a need to protect some quite volatile congeners and esters. Hence why that Glencairn or tulip glass is now so widely utilized in so many different bars and restaurants. Even if they may be a completely agave focused program, they're probably going to have some of those laying around.
It's funny you mentioned that, though. I absolutely agree. But I'm thinking to some of the really high ester rums I've had, and actually there I'd almost sometimes want to tone it back. I might use a straight-sided glass just to keep some of it in. Not to say it's bad flavors, but it's just so literally in your face that I want to kind of keep it away from me slightly.
Exactly. Well, that's why God gave you arms, David. Just move it farther away from your face hole.
True, right? Face hole.
Right. So
speaking of that, yours.
Yeah. So something that I do not, that I obviously don't take incredibly great care of are my eyes. Obviously, I've indicated that by being somebody who refuses to wear my contacts and glasses almost at every turn of the occasion, and then may occasionally also face plant off of a bunk bed at Camp Run Amok. But we're not here to talk about that.
How you managed to punch yourself in the face whilst falling off a bunk bed simultaneously, well, I'll never understand, Cam.
We will never know. You
will never know. Right. Anyway, moving on.
Right. So moving on, the next sense that's engaged in this scientific experiment of drinking whiskey is actually going to be the visual sense, right? How color plays a part in what our mind tells us about the alcohol and water solution that is whiskey, right?
So you got to be super careful here, because you can be certainly in the world of Scotch whiskey and in some other spirits as well. You can be taken for a ride. But Cam, why don't you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's an idea that when color is transmitted from the eye to the brain releases a hormone that affects emotion, mind clarity, and then as well as energy levels. The negative and positive physiological effect of colors can be observed in human beings based on the combination in which they are used. So whiskeys and any spirit with any sort of coloration to it, whether that coloration comes naturally or even if it comes from E150A, or even if it comes from other color contributing factors, they will have an effect on the way that your brain perceives that whiskey or spirit, but then also how it perceives the way in which consuming it is going to have an effect on your physical body as well, which I find incredibly interesting, that there is a link not only between your eyes and the way that your brain is going to process something, but then how your brain and your body are actually going to feel after you've consumed and processed.
Yeah, I mean, there's been all sorts of crazy studies in the past where people have been shown an apple whilst they've been, without being able to see what they're eating, presented with an onion to bite into. and to them it tastes like an apple.
Yeah.
That just blows my mind, that idea that something as extreme as an onion can taste like an apple because you're looking at an apple and you didn't see that it wasn't, and you thought it was. Another one that's classic, all sorts of experiments over the last couple of decades with candies, things like, jelly beans, and coloring the jelly bean to the wrong color for the flavor that you'd expect, but people still taste the flavor they expect related to the color. So, your sense of vision is much more important in this than you think. And one of the proofs of that, Cam, as you know, in the sensory labs of just about all the Scotch whiskey companies that I know of, they'll have Glencairns, they'll have Capitas, but they'll also have somewhere in that room a set of dark blue glasses as well. And that's intentional so that when the experts need to be certain that they're not skewed by the color of the whiskey, they can't see the color. So they'll have someone else pour the samples into blue glasses, and then they'll nose and taste it from there. And that takes most of that visual thing out and allows you to taste the whiskey for what it is rather than what you're expecting. The color, as you said, can be natural. It can be in Scotch whiskey, sadly, down to spirit caramel coloring. But, I think we're going to talk about this in a minute. You can often get the same very rich dark color from a series of vastly different cask treatments. And but at the same time, the most common one, I think, if people were to say, if you were to ask someone, that's a really dark mahogany single malt, they would jump to the conclusion that it was heavily sherried, which it might be, but often no, it could be something completely different. And if you let the color affect you psychologically before you've even tasted it, you're going to start writing tasting notes that are preempting the idea that it's a sherry cask matured whiskey, for example.
Absolutely, yeah, and that brings us back around to the conversation of the color of whiskey. Right?
Yeah.
So I've gone ahead and I've laid out how I generally would view different cask types and their effect on the colorations of different whiskeys, right? So from things like virgin American oak, let me grab my Ardbeg NO over here. Yeah. Right, so something like Ardbeg NO, which is a little bit difficult to see. Here we go. Yeah. Ardbeg NO is a wonderful whiskey that is comprised of some mature distillate that was wholly matured in virgin American oak casks, some that was wholly matured in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks, and some that was matured in standard ex-bourbon barrels as well. So from something like a virgin American oak cask, you're going to get a lot of rich copper or even ambered hues, and this is due to amount of extractable oak lactone, and as well as 100% of congeners that are still left in the hemicellulose of that oak because it's never contained a spirit. Before. I'd also say that there's an element of a fresh char on that cask as well. So there's a lot of flavor contributing congeners, but then they're also really good for removing some things like sulfuric compounds, which obviously you can't see. But the effect of the color on a whiskey, whenever we look at Ardbeg NO, even though it's a non-age statemented whiskey, I may be pushed to assume that it may be a bit younger than Ardbeg 10-year-old, but its coloration is quite a bit richer and quite a bit deeper. David,
I think you've got to be careful as well, cask by cask. Yes, as a general rule, what you're saying, absolutely. But we've all discovered, luckily, going into warehouses, that there can be complete contradictions to that. Heavily charred casks that have actually had some mature whiskey put into them, and it's got lighter. Refill sherry butts that are very, very light, of course, often. So that there's a general theme here for sure, but you can always find contradictions to it. So again, when you're assessing cask by cask by cask in a sensory lab, you don't have the luxury of kind of being able to say, I know what's coming, because you don't. There's going to be surprises all the time, hence the blue glasses. And sadly, whilst it's perfectly legal to use, and our sister distillery Glenmorangie, from time to time we use a little bit of spirit caramel in a few of our products. Ardbeg, thankfully, Ardbeg is spirit caramel free, we do not use it. And I think that's testament to the fact that we feel we can rely on our Ardbeg fans to be knowledgeable enough not to worry about it. If the whiskey looks really light, it's not a sign that there's something wrong. In fact, it's a sign of it being genuine. The second thing, of course, as well, is that we bottle everything in dark green bottles. So you don't get to see the color very well in Ardbeg, do you? Till you're pouring it out of the bottle, which is an interesting concept.
Yeah. And, I think that's just another one of the things that adds to the duality of Dr. Bill as a whiskey distiller and also whiskey blender as well. Is that, yes, at Glenmorangie, there is the occasional use of E150A, and I don't view that as an egregious. I don't even think that E150A is by nature a sin. I would actually say that it can be used for consistency's sake, but then also on the other end of that spectrum, it can be used for more nefarious.
I mean, when you're dumping it in and really getting a very dark color from the spirit caramel, you can get to a point where you can taste it in the whiskey, and if you can taste the spirit caramel in the whiskey, then there's a problem. Luckily, it's a powerful compound that changes the hue of a whiskey very quickly, and at the microscopically tiny amounts that we might use at Glenmorangie here and there on something like the original, there's no way you're going to taste it at all. Not even a super taster would pick it out. And we know that. We've done the blind nosings and tastings, ad infinitum to prove that. But overall, I would rather not see it in whiskey. That's just a personal point of view, and I'm glad that Ardbeg doesn't.
I definitely agree. I 100% agree. And to that point of being able to taste it, I'd actually argue that the more nefarious utilizations of it are not only do they affect taste. I do agree that they would affect taste, but I think that they actually play out what we were talking about with the previous slide. We're saying that it tells you a story. It tells your brain a story about that whiskey that may not necessarily be true. And then that story is communicated to your body and then also to your mind in terms of the value of a whiskey I'm using.
It can certainly be seem a little bit disingenuous, to put it mildly, and gives me the kind of suspicion that type of whiskey is trying to come across as older and from rarer, more expensive casks than it actually is, But thankfully we don't have to worry about that at Ardbeg, and everything you're getting there is the natural color from the cask. And the other point here is that at Ardbeg, the cask, whilst it can be important, of course, probably plays a little bit less of an effect on the final whiskey than many other single malts, simply because we start off with this incredibly intense new spirit before it even gets in the cask. You can't talk about Ardbeg without talking peat and smoke, can you?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So let's go ahead and kick back over to the next slide there as well, and let's talk a little bit about ex-bourbon barrels versus sherry casks. You kind of already hinted at it and gave it away a couple of minutes ago there. But the coloration of sherry casks. Would you care to talk a little bit about how you are able to perceive and tell a whiskey with a moderate degree of certainty? If
I'm going to be honest here, I often personally find it quite tough, unless it's a blatantly, obviously dark mahogany whiskey that is going to lead me, sometimes incorrectly, to think, right, sherry cask. Casks that are refill sherry butts, again, depending on the type of sherry as well, can really not give the game away too much. You'll get a whiskey that could easily have, from its color, be an ex-bourbon barrel or something, and a very different flavor profile. Though you get that much more kind of nutty, honeyed note coming through. So tough one. Outside of the obvious, first fill sherry cask richness. After that, I tried to I try to keep an open mind rather than assuming it's going to be any type of cask, to be honest.
I definitely agree. I think that the Ardbeg Wee Beastie actually is a really great example of this, right? Where there is sherry cask that's being utilized, and that whiskey does have a little bit of a mahogany or even like a browning or bronzing that started to creep into the corners. Years ago, our good friend Brendan McCarran, who now is head distiller over at Bunnahabhain Tobermory Lecheg, he said that Ardbeg is quite rough and ready, that it really takes a bludgeoning to get color contributing congeners to stay in solution.
That is true. I've heard that as well, that even with Ardbeg just filled into American white oak casks, it doesn't pull color from the cask very quickly at all. And you go to the extreme. Looking at Ardbeg 10 in a glass, I mean, it's one of the lightest colored whiskeys out there. It's been 10 years in ex-bourbon barrels, and it's picked up next to no color.
No, absolutely.
Not to say it hasn't picked up flavor. Again, these things are not necessarily linked at all.
No. And then being a massive Corey Vrecken fan, which we won't be today together. Unfortunately, I'm a huge Corey Vrecken fan as well. The effects of European oak cannot be overstated on any in particular whiskey. Corey Vrecken, I see having this beautiful, almost like rich gold with then a hints of like jalapeno or green that just kind of
I know what you mean
there as well.
Yeah, big time, absolutely. Again, can be tough sometimes though, but as a general rule, I think you're right there. And then of course the one at the bottom here is fairly obvious and can sometimes be extreme. The use of a port cask or often some really active red wine casks are at times going to give you whiskey that is almost, can be blush, can be like a rosé, can be pink in color, which is always a talking point. That's for sure. Some versions, some years, some bottlings of our sister distillery Glenmorangie's Kinta were incredibly pink in color. Others were less so. And my previous career at the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, I remember trying some single cask whiskies that had been entirely aged in port casks, and just bright pink, neon pink, sometimes tasted like kind of strawberry jam, and not for everyone, but I remember loving it. It was great. It was fun. It's different, something a bit different, quirky.
The other thing that I'd like to add here as we start to change into the next slide is that the color of a whiskey isn't the only thing that's being communicated when you're looking at a glass of whiskey. You can also now start to be able to tell things like alcohol by volume and ABV content, as well as now start to take educated guesses at the types of casks that are going to be employed. So interestingly, in not only limited to single malt Scotch whiskey, but from spirits around the world, there is a conversation that's happening when you start to swirl that whiskey around, or if you swirl whatever spirit you're talking about. Even vodka will actually do this as well. This is actually a really great way to be able to discern vodkas like Belvedere, vodkas like Tito's, vodkas like Grey Goose, that all have different grain / ingredients that have been utilized in them. You can now start to tell a little bit about the way that those things are going to behave on the palate based on what is actually called the Maragoni effect. And so effectively what you're going to do is you're going to take that whiskey and or spirit, hopefully for the sake of this conversation, it's going to be whiskey. I recommend not necessarily swirling it aggressively, because again, remember, whiskey and any alcohol is actually a solution. Remember, there's some high and low volatility esters and aromatic compounds, as well as congeners that can quite literally be swirled out of solution. So I generally treat my whiskey quite gently. And when instead of swirling it, I merely stretch it to the edges of the glass. And what you're going to allow to happen is you're going to allow the legs to start to develop. And these are actually, I refer to them as legs. I've also put on here that I've heard them referred to as tiers or cathedral windows as well.
Yeah.
And effectively what's happening is that as you swirl or stretch that whiskey, you're allowing some of that alcohol to now evacuate the solution, which is going to as you get farther away from the heart of that glass, the whiskey that is starting to adhere to or stick to the edge of that glass theoretically has a lower alcohol concentration. And now it becomes a conversation between texture and then also temperature as well as gravity. So things like water has a much lower actually I should say alcohol has a much lower effectively like it is influenced at a lower temperature by the effects of gravity than water is. So as you start to stretch that alcohol away from the glass, the lower alcohol concentration allows for more water to effectively adhere and basically bring that whiskey along with it back down into the heart of the glass. So the slower the legs start to develop, effectively now you get to start to take a guess at the actual ABV of the liquid itself, and you also get to take an educated guess at the amount of extractives that are in the solution as well. Yeah. Because things like oak lactones are going to increase the amount of surface tension. So the higher the surface tension is, the slower those legs are going to start to recede or rescind back down into the heart of the glass there. So the Maragoni effect really actually not only tells us effectively what the ABV of a whiskey is going to be, but then also how it can also behave on our palates as well. Is the finish going to be lipid and quite long, or is it going to move vertically quite quickly, right up and down on your palate, or is it going to move left to right a little bit more lipid and almost behave a little bit more fatty?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's kind of fun to sit there and kind of contemplate your whiskey and see these beautiful cathedral windows, these tiers, legs coming down the glass there. All the science is great, but just to sit there, it's part of the experience again, and it contributes back to that visual sense.
Yeah. So that actually leads us now into seeing texture, right? So the speed at which the legs flow down the sides of the glass and their thickness will give you an indication of as to the character of the whiskey. Higher level of oak extractives, as I had mentioned, and other oils will contribute to the speed and weight of the legs. The legs therefore help give you an idea of the strength, the spirit character, and the level of interaction of the whiskey. One of the things, and I often hear here as well, is that that level of extraction is indicative of age, which is not necessarily true.
No, not at all.
As we had kind of briefly discussed there, things like virgin American oak or virgin European oak have much higher congeners and lactose to be able to.
I would argue that if you got a sample of young, like 6-year-old virgin French oak Ardbeg at cask strength, the legs are going to be extreme. It's going to be oily, fatty, incredibly textural whiskey at a high proof with lots of alcohol. Whereas you can get a whiskey that's frankly too old, that's been sitting in a cask forever, and then maybe sat in a bottle forever after that, and there's basically no legs. Others there'll be incredible legs, yes, but there's no. I don't think there's really much of a correlation between the age of the whiskey and legs. Many people would disagree with me there, but you read into what you believe as much as you want.
Exactly. I am not one of those people that will disagree with you on that. I disagree with you on a whole host of other
most things,
all the time almost. But this is one where we're basically in lockstep here as well. So awesome. All of this is before we've even really theoretically, all of this is happening before we've actually even raised our glass to our olfactory system, which is going to be the next sense that we're going to engage. So we've already talked about how you hear whiskey, or even how the auditory effect of an environment can affect your experience drinking a whiskey. We've now also talked about looking at whiskey in terms of what the story is that's communicated to our brains, and then also our body, as well as our pocketbooks when we're based on the coloration of a whiskey as well, and the Maragoni effect. And then now we get to talk about the olfactory system, which is Dan Crowell's absolute favorite word. So Dan, who is our national Glenmorangie ambassador, is absolutely obsessed with smelling stuff. As he
retronasal olfaction.
Exactly.
It's going to be literally written as an epitaph.
Yep, exactly. So let's go back to the previous one there. So the olfactory system. The olfactory system is one of the most acutely and innately dialed in tools that you have in your tool case to be able to analyze whiskey. There is an incredibly rich connection between your sense of memory and your olfactory system. So if you want to develop a greater palate, it actually doesn't start with drinking more. I know I should always be encouraging people to go out and buy more Ardbegs to work on their palate, but it's actually developed a little bit more innately by simply just going to your supermarket and buying different spices, taking a step outside and every day trying to interact with, catalog, engage with different senses as well.
Dr. Bill Lumsden can be a bit of a liability sometimes. You walk him into a supermarket and he'll start just picking things up and smelling them. And, that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, he'll suddenly smell a whiff of perfume and he'll be off trying to smell somebody's clothing. Bill, you're going to get arrested for this. But the joking aside, it is really important and it's a great way. I think we're all born with a certain ability, greater or lesser, to nose and taste. But wherever we are, we can on that scale, we can develop that sense of smell further by training it. Absolutely. And often the biggest challenge is actually to be able to translate what you're smelling into something that you can communicate and understand. The number of times, I would say it's 99.9% of nosings, where somebody will at some point say, oh, I know what that is. I just can't quite put my finger on it, So it helps with that a lot. When you see a tasting note for whatever it is, gentian or, some floral note or food, if you haven't ever experienced that, how are you going to possibly relate to it? So it's important for sure.
Absolutely. I think due to the nature of one individual's upbringing and also their predispositions to different aromatic compounds. Like, for instance, growing up in the Pacific Northwest, because I grew up here, whenever I smell things like Ardbeg 10, or even actually really Ardbeg Anno does it quite well, something called like petrichor. Immediately snaps into my brain because I grew up in a place that oscillated, especially during the summertime, between quite warm with rainfall and thunderstorms, and then it would start to heat up, and I'd smell the asphalt, right? So petrichor is that compound of wet rain hitting asphalt. That to me is I have a predisposition to it because of where I grew up. David, are there any notes that that you can kind of attribute directly to your upbringing?
I'm trying to think. I mean, I can tell you one thing is that over the years, with representing both Glenmorangie and Ardbeg for quite a while now, there have been many, many times where I've had to go back to the team in Scotland and say, hey, the official tasting notes here don't make any sense to a US audience, because there are words you're using that just aren't US American words, or they're referencing a food that doesn't make sense. Classic example is Ardbeg Ugadal. And, just about everyone, including myself, I have to say, who from Scotland presents Ugadal at some point says notes of Christmas cake. To a large swathe of America, what's a Christmas cake? Down in Texas, if I say it's a fruit cake, a whiskey cake, then they get it because they're almost identical. If I'm in parts of the Caribbean, again, that kind of fruitcake idea, it translates. Other parts of but most of the US doesn't get it. Turkish Delight, that Middle Eastern candy, candy's the wrong word, sort of, I guess, kind of sweet, that is popular in Turkey and the kind of Eastern Mediterranean. I know it because there was a kind of a very commercialized version of that made by Mars, called Fry's Turkish Delight, which every little schoolboy from the 1980s, when they had enough cash, would be off to the sweetie store and every now and then buying a little packet of Turkish Delight in this little pink purple wrapper, and it's chocolate coated and tastes like, and the inside is like Jello almost, and it was rose water flavored, and very particular thing. And if you don't know Turkish Delight in any form, again, it makes no sense. So traveling around the US, Glenmorangie Kinta Ruban, I'd always refer to it with a dash of water as reminding me of Turkish Delight. And I stopped saying it pretty much. I would now and then test the water to see if the audience understood. And most of the US, blank looks. Went to Detroit. Everybody nodded. Everybody knew what Turkish Delight was. Yeah. I think it's down to the sort of way that immigration had hit different parts of the US. There were a lot of people of Middle Eastern origin in Detroit, and so much so that that had come, the knowledge of Turkish Delight had spread out of those communities into the general community. So everybody nodded in Detroit. Everyone knew what Turkish Delight was. Go somewhere else, an hour or two flight away, not a clue. So yeah, absolutely. These very personal aromas and flavors. And the biggest one for me is when I get to travel to places the other side of the planet, China, India, Malaysia, with completely different food cultures. Whilst we've kind of globalized a lot, and I'm a fairly adventurous eater, there's nothing like going to the country to really experience the full impact of the aromas and flavors there. And these people in each of these countries have grown up with that. So of course, when they write their tasting notes for the same whiskey I'm tasting, they're vastly different. And I love that. It's thought, that you can have a group of 20 people in a room all tasting the same whiskey. And because there are a sufficient number of flavor active compounds in that whiskey, and human beings can only pick up, each of us can only pick up a tiny subset of all those, it's highly possible, pretty much a given, that every single person in the room is having a completely different flavor and olfactory experience from the same whiskey. That blows my mind. 20 people tasting the same thing, all tasting different things.
Yeah, exactly. It's just absolutely wild.
Love it.
Before we kick into the second part of the conversation with olfaction, I think we should talk a little bit about how the system in general works and what it really is, right?
Sure.
So the olfactory system, as we have on the slide here, is the bodily structures that serve as a sense of smell. The system consists of the nose and nasal cavities.
Yeah.
Upper parts of the olfactory mucous membrane for the perception of smell, and it's their lower parts that act as the respiratory passages. One of the things I find really interesting with even just talking about your nostrils is that they're a bit like using a microscope, right? Even though you're looking through the microscope with both of your eyes, as you start to adjust both of the knobs here, one starts to adjust it to basically start to focus in on the mass that you're analyzing. The other really dives into the minutia and kind of focuses it in. So if you were to hold up a mirror in front of your face and breathe through your nose onto the mirror, you would see two marks of condensation, right? And that's indicative of the fact that, yes, both of your nasal passages absolutely are working. But one of those top dots would actually be significantly larger.
Yeah.
So it's thought that most human beings, that are not most, all human beings have one dominant nostril.
Yeah.
And that nostril is the one that is used dominantly for the respiratory system. The other nostril is the one that now starts to act as your fine-tuning element, your pathfinder, if you will. And that one is actually slows the rate of intake, so that you can actually start to perceive more flavor profiles and olfactory experiences, as you called them so eloquently.
I would say, I mean, I personally feel, and I've never had anyone test me for this, but I have a strong suspicion that I have an extreme of that. I think one of my nostrils, my left nostril, is almost like useless. I don't really get anything. It's all coming through my right nostril, which is a weird thing. But there, it's fun. If you don't believe me out there, fun thing. Go and nose a whiskey and close off one nostril at a time. You'll experience completely different things. It's a crazy idea.
Yeah, even just doing that with the tenure that I've got here right now, as I start to inhale through my left nostril, there's definitely not as much of a vegetal kind of aspect to the whiskey. It's more citrus, and it seems like it's just moving really quickly.
Yeah.
And then as I dive in on my right side here, now I can actually get the perceived sweetness. The cereal grain element of the whiskey as well starts to become a little bit more fully developed. So I think it is quite interesting. For me, what that tells me is that my left nostril, and it actually is this way for the majority of human beings, or at least that have undergone through this study, that their dominant nostril is actually their left one. And I would actually tend to agree. For myself here, again, it's a subjective experiment. There are no 100% or absolutes.
And you see, I'm the other way, but then I am left-handed, so you would expect maybe things to be switched.
Exactly.
Interesting. If you're kind of doubting what we're saying here at all, a lot of this can be chemically proven, and there's a very expensive but useful piece of kit called a mass spectrometer olfactometer, which a mass spectrometer allows us to put a sample of whiskey and it'll break it down into its constituent molecules, and you can actually record those and work out what the structure of each of those molecules is. Fair enough. The olfactometer bit is a second part to this particular piece of kit that will then it has like a trumpet on the front, and a human subject can sit there with their schnoz right on this trumpet, and the machine will pump out little jets of the individual compounds that it's broken down. So whilst it's recording the molecular structure of each of these, the subjects will be writing down what they perceive that to smell like. And so we can absolutely identify a lot of that flavor work has been done by figuring out what each of these aromas, what molecules actually smell like. So again, it's fascinating, that kind of blend of a bit of science to understand a little bit more. And I love the fact that we don't understand it all, because it would be boring if we got it all figured out. And if we ever figure it all out to that extent, one of the bean counters is going to say, right, let's just fabricate whiskey artificially. Not into that.
No. I don't love it as well. I don't love it. Right. So moving forward into a little bit more about the olfactory system. The olfactory system actually has two different utilizations and work rates. So there's orthonasal olfaction, which occurs when sniffing. This is effectively intaking data through your schnoz. I like that term. I'm now going to put that in the back pocket and start utilizing that all the time at some of my tastings. This is essentially, this light switch goes on when you're smelling things. The retronasal olfactory pathway, which contributes to the flavor of food or drinking, is commonly associated with the sense of taste. So retronasal is the perception of odors emanating from the oral cavity during eating and drinking. So retronasal olfactory pathway contributes to flavors in food and drinks. It is kind of one-on-one linked with your sense of taste.
Yeah,
So,
and it's why it's so important when you're tasting a whiskey. Yeah, nose it, but when it's in your mouth, you do not shoot it for many reasons. It's irresponsible anyway. But you are never giving you're shutting off really any opportunity for retronasal olfaction. You've got to let that whiskey sit in your mouth for a while so that you can have so some of those compounds have a chance to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why generally when I'm drinking whiskey, now this is the part where we get to talk about once it hits your lips, it's so divine and so delicious. The way that I complete this circuit is actually by exhaling after my first sip. And that then recommunicates retronasally a lot of the data that was communicated to my orthonasal passageway is recommunicated to that bulb on the exhale. Again, to use the analogy of using like a microscope, this basically is fine tuning and finding the minutia of a lot of the flavors that we were actually smelling.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also another little trick to help your orthonasal olfaction, and this kind of makes you look a bit stupid, but hey, I look stupid anyway. But when you do it, drop your chin and open your mouth and just let your mouth hang open when you nose, and it seems to really, I can't explain it 100%, but it seems to really help me pick up more. I think it's because it's bringing in a little bit of that retronasal as well.
I agree. Yeah, 100%. I definitely do take the mouth breather approach, where I'll just leave my chin down ever so slightly, not completely wide mouth there, but ever so slightly. That way, then as I'm inhaling, I'm also able to kind of complete the communication circuit there between the retro and orthonasal olfactory bulb system, which again, they're both bringing that information to the apex. If you can kind of see the diagram off to the right of the slide here, you'll actually be able to see that basically right below your frontal cortex, you'll actually have your smell receptor or your olfactory epithelium, as it's actually technically called, right? And so then that is what communicates both smell and flavor back to your sense of memory, as well as the other data receiving portions of your brain as well there. Yeah,
indeed.
So now we get to talk about the actual taste buds. Again, we've now covered how you hear whiskey, and how the auditory experience of any situation where you're drinking whiskey may have an effect on your whiskey. What you learn from the visual application and looking at a glass of whiskey in terms of being able to now tell a story of how that whiskey is going to behave on your palate, and then also being able to take educated guesses at things like ABV, as well as things like previous occupants or lack thereof in the casks as well. Now we've also talked about the olfactory and retronasal olfactory systems and how those things communicate smell and taste at the exact same time. But the taste buds are incredibly important as well here. So if you were to, again, look in front of a mirror and stick your tongue out, you would see that your tongue has hundreds of little bumps on it, right? And those bumps collectively are called papilla. Those papilla themselves actually contain taste buds, and those taste buds actually are microscopic hairs. And those microscopic hairs called macrovilli. That's a difficult one. Macrovilli. Those teeny hairs send messages to the brain about how something tastes. And as we know, there are 5 overarching flavor profiles or tastes that your taste buds are able to perceive: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and lastly, umami. So when I'm diving into a glass of, let's take Ardbeg NO, even for instance here, when I'm diving into a glass of Ardbeg NO and I'm taking a look at the coloration of the whiskey, really beautiful kind of bronzing or even browning or coppering that starts to creep into the corners there. As I move it away from the glass ever so slightly, the legs take a little while to develop. Gravity moves them really, really slowly. So again, I know that this whiskey is going to have a little bit of a mouth coating factor to it as well. I'm also able to take an educated guess at the ABV, which I would guess is just slightly over 46%. Turns out I'm right. It's 46.6.
How did you guess?
How did I guess? But then
The
also,
other thing that you can use your eyes for is reading the label. It's amazing.
yeah, true. You can just read the label itself there as well.
Yes.
And then lastly, the actual taste of the whiskey itself. So because I've wet my whistle here a couple of times today already, Ardbeg NO has this salty and umami sweetness to the whiskey. So it really highlights three of the 5 different flavor profiles. Something like Ardbeg 10-year-old for me definitely still has a little bit of a sweetness, but there is also a sourness to the whiskey that comes from the citrus. David, for you, when you're drinking Ardbeg 10, what are some of the flavors that you're getting out of that whiskey?
I know what you're meaning. I mean, the citrus there is, for me, very specifically like lime juice, and lime is, for me, probably the most grown up of the citruses. It often has this unusual green, earthy back to how lime tastes, and I think you get that in Ardbeg 10. But Ardbeg 10 for me is usually there's this funny back and forth in my mind between pretty intense creamy sweetness, and then just as I think I've picked that up, it's gone, and there's the absolute opposite. There's a kind of dusty dryness in there, and then just as I think I've got that, the sweetness is back, and in amongst all that, of course, there's the smokiness, there's this meaty note, and finishing off with this sometimes fairly elusive kind of sour green lime juice note as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's then, of course, you also have Ardbeg Wee Beastie. Wee Beastie for me, it is ranks the lowest in terms of the 3 in terms of its sweetness. The sour application of the whiskey as well, I don't necessarily see lime. I see a little bit of like orange, maybe even a little bit of lemon creeping into Ardbeg Wee Beastie. But for me with Beastie, it is the most bitter of the 3 whiskeys, and I mean like bitter like almond. There is like there's a nutty bitterness to that whiskey that is based on the fact that part of that whiskey has been wholly matured in sherry casks as well there. Any thoughts on Beastie?
I don't particularly pick up the bitterness, but that's the beauty of tasting whiskey and talking about whiskey is going back to what I said, everyone's palates are uniquely theirs. As you said, thankfully I can't taste whiskey with your face either. So, it's a personal thing. Wee Beastie for me, yeah. I'm trying to think. There's what am I really picking up in Wee Beastie? There's a bit of that kind of slightly green pepper note, something like that, maybe. Not sure.
Yeah. Something that we had always heard is that that there are sections of the tongue that are specifically dedicated to picking up either sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami, and that simply is just not true.
Yeah, it seems to have been discredited in the last few years, right? Yeah. That kind of classic, and I've even presented it in the past. That classic idea of different sections of the tongue. Apparently not. All of the taste buds are able to do all of it. So I mean, it doesn't stop me believing sometimes that I do pick up more of the kind of sour notes around the sides of my tongue, on the edges of my tongue, but that may be more just perception than any innate difference in the papilla. You know.
Exactly. You know, let me see if I can find it, but I believe it was in the Smithsonian, published an article that was basically that there are sections of the tongue that may have a predisposition to tasting specific elements of the 5 overarching flavor profiles, but that in no way are they designated to only perceive.
Sure. Yeah. Otherwise, it's fair. I would have thought that was always fairly clear. Otherwise, you'd have some pretty weird tasting experiences.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So I just went ahead and sent that on over as well, which hopefully they'll put that up into the chat here. I know that we are, a little pressed on time here, but but Lindsay, I'm wondering if we have any pertinent questions as we bring our how to taste whiskey to a close here.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions for you guys. The first is a question that was posed to Vic, actually, in the comments from Skipper, saying, because Vic mentioned that he had his haggis, neeps, and tatties, and Skipper wants to know what the heck they are. So, David, I feel like you could probably illuminate
haggis, neeps, and tatties. Oh, first off, it's heaven, absolute heaven to some people. So haggis, neeps, tatties is a traditional Scottish dish. Haggis probably needs no explaining, or probably shouldn't be explained, but it's basically just like all over Europe and many other countries as well. It's a traditional sausage of sorts. It's usually served. It's quite a big sausage that will be the meat will be spooned out of it onto a plate. So you have your haggis. Neeps is turnips or swede, and tatties is potatoes. So haggis, potatoes, and turnips. Doesn't it sound delicious? When done correctly, it is. I will defend haggis to the death.
I thought you might have an answer for Skipper there.
I will also have your back there in defending haggis. Good. I will say the first, actually, it would have been my first time having haggis would have been when I went over to Scotland as a kid to go hang out on the Shetland Isles. But the more recent one had happened in, I want to say it was in having true haggis, because here in the States it is
get it.
You can't get it. But I will never forget having dinner with you and your dad at first supper at the vaults, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society vaults in Edinburgh. And that was probably back in like 2018, I want to say now.
Maybe even earlier. Yeah.
Maybe earlier than that now. Yeah, it might have been 2017, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And I basically, I did not want to be the first person to put my fork down. And so as soon as Mr. Blackmore, David's father, finished his haggis, I was like, great, all right, cool. I can now quit on this, and now I just have this immense love of it. I mean, had haggis pudding.
It may be an acquired taste, but like most acquired tastes, it's worth acquiring. And actually, if you're a bit of a foodie, it's the famous one, but there are many other sausages, or sometimes called puddings, even across the UK. So black pudding, which is blood sausage, Stornoway up out on the Western Isles. Stornoway black pudding is actually protected under the same sort of European geographic protection as champagne and Scotch whiskey. It's that good. Southwest of England, in Devon, and in Devon particularly, there's a thing called a hog's pudding. Again, looks just like a haggis, but it's delicious and often eaten instead of haggis, neeps, and tatties. Hog's pudding you would eat with something called laver. And laver is a locally harvested seaweed that you serve it with. So interesting things you can experience. There's white pudding as well, all sorts of different sausages around the UK.
Amazing. So to get maybe back on topic,
Yes.
sorry about the little detour there. I had to ask. So Kim, when you were talking about sounds, you mentioned a hormone, and Grant was wondering if you knew the name of that hormone.
I do not, but let me dive back into my notes here, because I bet I took that note here. Mm,
You know our friends, they love science.
Yeah,
That's why they're here. And that's why they're my friends.
Where is that note?
Well,
We'll pass that back to you. Yes.
Perfect. We can always come back to that. And then the last question I have so far is, what are your thoughts on the effect of hybrid barrels, i.e. ex-bourbon staves combined with ex-port staves to create a new singular barrel versus taking the barrels individually and blending?
Something that, from my perspective, it's interesting. Something we've kind of tried to get an answer out of Bill Lumsden about, and he's very cagey about having an opinion openly about it at all. So I can't help you in terms of an official answer any more than that, but I would think it would be quite interesting. There are other interesting ideas you could have around that we're messing with too, but I'll leave it at that. But yeah, potentially quite interesting, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I would, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the question as well here. I was still stuck in hormone talk, and it turns out that is oxytocin as well, which should have guessed.
Thank you.
The common one that is mood elevating. Thoughts and effects on hybrid barrels. I combine and port staves to create newer singular barrels. Just taking the barrels. Graham, I love you. I know exactly where this question is stemming from. Which that whiskey was quite interesting. And for anybody who was wondering, Graham was also at camp. So I recently got to have a couple of different conversations with him about a few different whiskeys. My thoughts on recoupering casks with an assortment of different staves. I would say that it makes that I would say that it probably, again, being that I'm not Dr. Bill, I would assume that there's probably an element of because those staves were not originally formed to go together, and the grain types are different. I would say that the angel share is probably a little bit higher in casks of that type, recoopered from orphan staves. I think that's how I'll probably refer to those from now on. I would also say that I really like the idea of something like Ardbeg Anno, or I prefer the idea of something like Ardbeg Anno that simply takes blending into that is built on blending, right? Because instead of being handcuffed to now having to use that whiskey for that specific project, I think I actually do prefer the idea of using the casks to create different styles of whiskey, which are then brought back together.
It does bring up an interesting thought in my mind, though, is that, you know, with the way that the Scotch whisky regulations are being enforced these days, a finished whiskey can no longer be described as a single cask whiskey because it's moved from one to the other. And therefore, if you were someone like the Scottish Malt Whisky Society, who kind of largely still specializes in single cask bottlings, it could be a very interesting tool to experiment with, at least, to be able to get yourself something that is a single cask whiskey that has had a percentage of a port influence without being fully port matured. So, you know, a couple of staves in there. Who knows? That's an interesting concept. You know, get around the problem that finishing can't provide a single cask whiskey.
Yeah. To be fair, that the whiskey that was in question is a blended whiskey coming from 3 different distilleries.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Huh. Yeah, I mean, there's lots there. It would be, you know, I think you're right in a sense there that if the woods are extremely different, you're going to have some problems. So I would start off by trying to use American white oak, regardless of what had been in it before, for all of it. I think if you could, I don't know, but I would assume that if you're using some American white oak staves and let's say some European oak staves, you might run into some bigger problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows?
Amazing. Well, Cam, David, thank you both so much for not just this class today, but for this entire run of Scotch whiskey certification. I cannot wait to see you both for the next round, which starts pretty soon. As I mentioned at the very top of the show, if you want to apply, there is still time. pdxcw.com/scotch. You only have a week to apply, so get that application in ASAP. We want to make sure that you're considered for the next round, because this program, not only what you see here in the public facing classes with Cam and David, you also get all kinds of behind the scene work with our friends at EWA. Cam, Vic, who's in the comments, I know that they get to talk to you a whole bunch, which is such a treat. So definitely sign up if you've ever wanted to learn every single thing about Scotch whiskey, which I know I do. I feel like I've learned so much in the last year just getting to kind of sit in on these classes. So thank you both so much. And for all of you out there who are watching, if you enjoyed this class, make sure that you like Portland Cocktail Week on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you might be watching. Follow us on Instagram at PDXCW. If you want to know the latest of what we're up to, whether it's Scotch whiskey certification or maybe hanging out with Cam somewhere else. We get to do that a lot. I'm very lucky. So thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you all very soon. Thanks, guys.